Prince Andrew loses his royal and military titles, and he'll no longer be officially known as His Royal Highness. Buckingham Palace says the prince is handing his titles back to the Queen and will continue to play no part in public life.
It's important that the problems that Prince Andrew has incurred sort of aren't bled over into the regiments that he was representing.
It comes a day after a judge in New York ruled the prince must defend an accusation of sexually assaulting Virginia Giuffre in a civil court case. The prince denies the accusation. Buckingham Palace says he will now defend himself as a private citizen. Also tonight, MI5 issues a rare alert, warning of a Chinese agent operating at the heart of Westminster, trying to influence MPs. The isolation period for anyone with COVID in England is being cut to 5 full days from next week.
COVID restrictions are to be eased in Wales as the data suggests the peak of the Omicron wave here has already passed.
Pro-democracy demonstrators in Sudan protesting against a military coup and facing a crackdown by security forces.
It's not a yoghurt that can be taken out of the fridge and put back in multiple times. It's really tricky.
And the king of analogy gives up his throne. Jonathan Van Tam, famous for his pithy phrases during the pandemic, steps down.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News Channel, all to play for Anfield as Arsenal take on Liverpool in the first leg of the delayed Carabao Cup semi-final.
Good evening. Buckingham Palace has announced that Prince Andrew is returning his royal and military titles to the Queen and will no longer be referred to as His Royal Highness in any official capacity. It comes after a court ruling in the US yesterday, which left the prince facing a civil case later this year against Virginia Giuffre, who says she was sexually assaulted by him 2 decades ago when she was a teenager. He has consistently denied the allegations. Prince Andrew retired from public duties in November 2019 after an interview about the claims with the BBC's Newsnight, and will now have to defend the court case as a private citizen. Here's our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell.
It was a day to take stock for Andrew, seen leaving his home near Windsor Castle this morning, to ponder the situation in which he now finds himself, a situation in which, for him, none of the options is a good one. The days of standing proudly on the balcony of Buckingham Palace in military uniform alongside his family, are over. His family, and particularly his elder brother Charles and his nephew William, had to put aside family feeling. The priority now was the family's protection from severe reputational damage. Just after 5 o'clock, Buckingham Palace issued a short statement regarding the Duke of York. With the Queen's approval and agreement, the Duke of York's military affiliations and royal patronages have been returned to the Queen. The Duke of York will continue not to undertake any public duties and is defending this case as a private citizen. At the same time, the palace let it be known that Andrew would no longer be known as His Royal Highness. So what does it all mean? It means we will never see Andrew like this again, riding as honorary colonel of the Grenadier Guards at Trooping the Colour. He stepped down, by mutual agreement we're told, from that position and from roles in nearly a dozen other regiments. He's also giving up roles in the Royal Navy and the RAF. In military circles there was considerable relief. The MP Tobias Ellwood is a former army officer.
The royal family has an intimate relationship with the regiments going back in history. Many of them are honorary colonels and so forth. And it's important that the problems that Prince Andrew has incurred sort of aren't bled over into the regiments that he was representing.
From sources close to Andrew, we were told he would fight on. The Duke will continue to defend himself against these claims, they said. The claims began more than 10 years ago now with the publication of this photograph of Andrew with the then 17-year-old Virginia Roberts, and this photograph of him with the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. In his Newsnight interview, Andrew said he rued the day he became involved with Epstein.
And that's the bit that as it were, I kick myself for on a daily basis, because it was not something that was becoming of a member of the royal family. And we try and uphold the highest standards and practices, and I let the side down. Simple as that.
2 years on from that interview, Andrew, Duke of York, second son of the Queen, 9th in line to the British throne, stands alone. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
Well, our correspondent Helena Wilkinson is in Windsor for us. And Helena, the Prince cuts a very isolated figure this evening.
Yes, he does. Windsor is where Prince Andrew lives, Rita. His home is around 3 miles away from the castle here in Windsor Great Park. And he is rarely seen out and about here, sometimes in the park, but that is about it. And since that interview with Newsnight in 2019, since he stepped back from public duties, he has led a very isolated life here. Now, he shares his home with his former wife here, Sarah Ferguson, and perhaps he is going to be turning to her in this moment. But going forward, we are not going to see Prince Andrew out and about again as a working member of the royal family. And that decision clearly designed to separate Prince Andrew's court case from the royal family's public duties. He will now focus on the case. The Queen, who should be celebrating this year her 70 years on the throne, the palace will be very much hoping that this decision about Prince Andrew will lift what was to be a very dark cloud over those celebrations. And as for Prince Andrew, Rita, going forward, he is going to be leading an even more isolated life here in Windsor.
Helena, thank you. Well, Nick Witchell joins me now. Nick, an unprecedented situation this for the royal family.
It is. I mean, a bit of context. The royal family really hasn't faced a situation such as this in modern time, with a senior member of the family, the second son of the monarch, facing an allegation of sexual assault in a court. An allegation, of course, which he denies. But the royal family have acted very quickly because the reputational risk is very considerable and very real. And I think we can detect the hands of Charles and William in all of this. It would be very odd if the Queen was not consulting them, was not taking their counsel, particularly, of course, in the absence now of the Duke of Edinburgh. They will be concerned, I'm sure, for Andrew at a human level, but they are very much more concerned for the reputation of the institution, as Helena was saying there. Now, Andrew's position regarding the regiments was plainly untenable. He has agreed, we're told he's agreed, not to use the styling of HRH anymore, and he will fight this case. He says he will fight it as a private citizen. Now, for Andrew, this must be devastating. The last bits of superstructure, of framework around him for the past 40 years have been taken away, have been stripped away. But his family are trying to protect the monarchy from any further, as it were, collateral contamination from this case.
Thank you very much, Nick. Nick Witchell, our royal correspondent. MI5 has issued a rare alert about a named individual, warning MPs of a woman who's been working as an agent for the Chinese state and trying to influence British politicians. The security service said that Christine Lee was engaged in political interference on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, said it was deeply concerning, but that the UK had measures in place to identify such activities. Here's our security correspondent, Gordon Carrera.
A figure at the heart of Westminster, with access to politicians from all parties, even a Prime Minister. But today, lawyer Christine Lee is accused of working secretly on behalf of the Chinese state. In a highly unusual move, MI5 today issued this alert to parliamentarians. They were warned Ms. Lee had been working with an arm of the Chinese Communist Party to covertly interfere in UK politics through establishing links with established and aspiring parliamentarians.
The fact that this alert has become public today in the way in which it has is really a very strong illustration of how our intelligence and security agencies have been working together to really spot and identify this type of activity, activity that could potentially do harm to our country and harm to our democracy.
There was no one here today at Christine Lee's London office, and she's not yet responded to the claims. The allegation is that she was funneling money to politicians, claiming it came from within the UK, when in fact it came from China, all in order to secure influence for the Chinese Communist Party. Former Labour frontbencher Barry Gardiner received more than £400,000 from her over 5 years. In a statement today, he said he'd been liaising with MI5 and he stopped receiving funding for parliamentary researchers in 2020, although Ms Lee's son was working in Mr Gardiner's office until he resigned today.
This is really serious. We don't play this down. I'm not running scare stories. I am genuinely concerned and shocked that this has been allowed to happen. We need to understand why and we need to do something about it. But we also have to recognise that the Chinese government poses a clear and present danger to us and stop messing around.
Today's alert came after what I'm told was a lengthy and serious investigation by MI5 here. But Christine Lee isn't being prosecuted. This isn't about spying in the traditional sense of stealing secrets. It's about influence. And the judgment was that the best way of disrupting her alleged activities was by issuing this very unusual warning. Inside British intelligence, concerns about Chinese influence have been growing in recent years. Today is a sign that those fears go right to the heart of Westminster, and we're told to expect more of these warnings in the future. Gordon Carrera, BBC News.
The Metropolitan Police say they'll wait for the result of a civil service inquiry into parties held at Downing Street and at government departments during COVID lockdowns before deciding whether to investigate. Boris Johnson apologised yesterday for attending a drinks party in the Downing Street garden in May 2020 during the first lockdown, saying he thought it was work-related. He remains under pressure from his party, with some senior Conservatives saying he should resign. Here's our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth.
There's no easy way to clean up the current situation, and since first thing, no sign of the Prime Minister. A planned public visit was cancelled because one of his family has COVID. While he hunkered down here, others spoke up for him after yesterday's apology.
He was ashen-faced, he was upset, he was truly, genuinely heartfelt sorry for the upset and the rage that people are feeling. He gets it.
On the airwaves, there was a chorus of loyalty.
There was no question in my mind Boris Johnson was acting in good faith.
With hindsight, he regrets going out to the garden.
He has apologised, very, very clearly.
The Cabinet have shown their support, including the Chancellor, though from him it was quieter.
Mr. Speaker, I want to apologise.
For many, yesterday's apology just didn't cut it. The mood among Tories is dim. Some critics are keeping their counsel for now, waiting perhaps to hear from their constituencies. Stamford in Lincolnshire is rock-solid Tory turf. Long-standing members of the Conservative Association were as one.
If he wants to be remembered as a good Prime Minister, then I think he has to consider, is it the time now to resign?
I think it would be better if he just resigned rather than waiting for a vote of confidence. I think he would get a lot more respect.
A lot of the long-serving members in the association have very vocally said that it's time for him to go.
Scotland's Tory leader has already said the same. His call for Boris Johnson to resign caused something of a party row.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, as anyone, is entitled to their opinions. I don't have to agree with them.
Jacob Rees-Mogg had called him a lightweight and questioned his loyalty. And now he's suggested lockdown rules might have been too tough at the time of the Downing Street gathering, asking today
whether all those regulations were proportionate or whether it was too hard on people.
Labour wasn't impressed. Here, frustration at the government is far from fading. Whether public or private, there is real anger across the Conservative Party at Boris Johnson. But many MPs are waiting for the findings of the official investigation before passing final judgment. Even when that's published in the next week or so, it's likely it will be the political mood that follows that ultimately determines the Prime Minister's fate. There's a lot riding on Sue Gray, the civil servant leading the Cabinet Office inquiry. Even the Met Police said today they'd wait for her findings before deciding if there's anything to investigate. Labour says the Prime Minister needs to act.
He knowingly misled, lied to Parliament, which in itself is a resignation offence under the Ministerial Code, but we're also calling for him to resign because of the damage that he's done to public trust and public confidence in health measures at a crucial time.
For now, Boris Johnson is in Downing Street. But make no mistake, this matter is far from closed. Alex Forsyth, BBC News, Westminster.
The isolation period for people testing positive for COVID in England is being cut to 5 full days from 7. The Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, announced that from Monday, people who've tested positive can leave isolation at the start of day 6, as long as they test negative on days 5 and 6. It's hoped it'll ease pressure on employers hit by staff absences. Here's our health correspondent, Sophie Hutchinson.
This restaurant in Manchester, one of 6 in a group employing around 500 people. Today, senior managers were raising a glass to government plans to lower the number of days for self-isolation.
From a business perspective, it's going to give people confidence to come out again. We've been seeing that over the last few months, and we really need to just take the shackles off and get things moving again.
We've made the decision to reduce the minimum self-isolation period to 5 full days in England. From Monday, people can test twice before they go, leaving isolation at the start of day 6.
And some scientists agree it is the right balance of risks.
The negative impacts of that isolation on our services, on our schools, on our jobs, is probably not worth the additional benefits. And I think the 5-day rule at the moment is probably the right thing.
So how long does it take to stop being infectious after getting COVID? Well, estimates suggest that at 14 days, the original isolation period, just 1% of people remain infectious. At 7 days, that figure increases to 16%. And at 5 days, the new minimum isolation period from next week, that figure increases again to around a third of people who are still infectious. That's why people will be required to have 2 negative lateral flow results before being released from self-isolation. The first test can now be taken on day 5, but some are urging caution.
If you do test negative and you are going to come out of isolation on day 6, you should still be cautious, particularly about interacting with vulnerable people. You should still be a little bit concerned that you might be infectious.
The new rules bring England into line with Scotland, but self-isolation is still 7 days long in Wales and Northern Ireland. Sophie Hutchinson, BBC News.
Let's take a look now at the government's latest coronavirus figures. And they show that there were 109,133 new infections in the latest 24-hour period. So there were 138,268 new cases on average per day in the last week. 19,721 people are in hospital with COVID. Another 335 deaths are reported. That's of people who died within 28 days of a positive test. On average, in the past week, there were 261 deaths per day. On vaccinations, just over 36 million people have had a booster jab, and that is more than 62.7% of those aged 12 and over. In France, where more than 300,000 new COVID infections have again been recorded, the government is reopening its borders to UK travellers tomorrow. Before Christmas, France imposed a ban on most people entering the country from the UK to try to slow the spread of Omicron. But from tomorrow, all vaccinated travellers will just have to show a negative PCR or lateral flow test taken 24 hours before departure. The Welsh Government is to start easing COVID restrictions after a fall in case numbers. Ministers are expected to set out a 2-week plan to lift the measures which came into place on Boxing Day, closing nightclubs and limiting numbers in pubs and restaurants. Well, our Wales correspondent Howell Griffith joins us now from the Senedd. And Howell, this is quite a shift in message from the Welsh Government.
Yeah, absolutely, Rita. It's less than a week since the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, was talking about Wales being in the grip of an Omicron storm. Well, it seems that there's been quite a sudden shift in outlook to something far more optimistic, driven by the data, which suggests actually the peak of the wave here in Wales may have passed at the beginning of January. So tomorrow we expect him to set out that plan to start easing the restrictions that were imposed back on Boxing Day. They could start as soon as this weekend with the end of the limit for outdoor activities. So park runs, for example, could operate in Wales with more than 50 runners. Later on, we could see crowds return to sports stadiums to watch bigger football and rugby matches. The rule of 6 could be scrapped in pubs, bars and restaurants, and eventually nightclubs could open once again here in Wales, all caveated with the fact that if there's a spike in cases, we could go back up the alert system. The other caveat, of course, is that the data has changed and the number of people who have to take PCR tests in Wales has changed. But I think if that is the message from Mark Drakeford tomorrow, it will be welcomed by most people here in Wales.
Howell, thank you. Howell Griffith reporting. The number of people on a hospital waiting list in England has hit another record high. Figures for the end of November show 6 million people were waiting for routine surgery. And in December, nearly 13,000 patients had to wait more than 12 hours in A&E for a bed to become available, another record. Our health editor Hugh Pym reports.
Birmingham. The pandemic's cast a long shadow here. The spread of COVID may be slowing, but as in many communities, it could take years to clear the backlog of cancelled operations.
So this one is a Hurricane Performante.
Ollie, who works in a car dealership, needs surgery, but he hasn't even been put on the waiting list yet.
They've supported me really, really well.
Ollie has Crohn's disease, which causes inflammation of the digestive system. He needed a bowel operation and now has a stoma and waste bag. He's still waiting to have that reversed.
It's life-changing. Obviously, there's obviously restrictions that I've got. There's self-awareness, there's mental issues that you're always thinking of people looking at you. Do I look different? There's a lot of aspects, and I'd like to obviously draw a line in it, have it done, have that procedure done, then move on with my life, really.
To give an idea of the scale of the waiting list, Birmingham has a population of just over 1 million. Close to 6 times that number are now waiting for planned surgery or procedures in England. Clearing the backlog is one thing, but here in the West Midlands and elsewhere, hospital staff are struggling with daily emergencies and colleagues getting ill.
More staff are off sick every single day.
Kishan is a doctor working locum shifts in A&E departments in the area.
It's been very stressful in A&E. There were days last week where I was receiving messages asking if I could come into work just for a few hours, but the concern that I have is how unpredictable it is with NHS staff going off sick and not knowing from one day to the next whether there'll be enough staff in the hospital on the floor able to look after the patients who are there.
It's a challenging time for hospitals across the UK. I spoke to an A&E nurse in Wales who wished to remain anonymous.
We've got elderly patients in cupboards on trolleys for hours on end. They're cupboards that don't fit beds. And this is what we're dealing with. It's a logistical nightmare, and it's unsafe, and it's just not what we all signed up for.
We are running on escalation numbers every day.
While not under the same pressure, most hospitals like this one in Warrington are very busy, with normal winter demands as well as COVID adding to the strain. NHS England said staff dealt with a record number of life-threatening ambulance call-outs last month, and services like cancer care were still prioritised. With changing seasons, the pressure may ease, but the NHS faces a difficult future, workforce shortages and rising waiting lists, issues which will feature prominently in the political landscape. Hugh Pym, BBC News, Birmingham.
Security forces in Sudan have today fired tear gas at thousands of pro-democracy protesters marching on the presidential palace in the capital, Khartoum. The country has been gripped by demonstrations since the military seized power in October last year, with protesters given fresh impetus by the resignation of the civilian Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok earlier this month. The military have responded with violence towards those on the streets. Medical organisations estimate that since protests began, dozens have been killed and hundreds wounded. Our Deputy Africa editor, Anne Soy, has more.
A march to the seat of power, disrupted yet again, violently. But Sudan's pro-democracy demonstrators remain resolute, even in the face of death. Walid Khalid lost his 17-year-old brother in protests which erupted to oppose the military coup last October. Like many protesters, he blames military generals for the violence on the ground.
Burhan is the commander of the uniformed forces. Any violence or violations against the protesters is on his hands. I accuse Burhan of killing my brother.
We won't stop rallying, and if anyone is killed, 5 others will rally. Even if we all get killed, the revolution will continue.
The protesters want the military to leave power. They were expected to hand over to the civilian leaders they had shared power with under an accord that was meant to lead Sudan to full democracy. Instead, they ousted the civilians. After intense international pressure, the generals reinstated the prime minister. But the people felt left out. They rejected the deal. The prime minister eventually resigned earlier this month, throwing the country deeper into crisis. The UN has launched a fresh bid for negotiations, but the protesters don't trust the men in uniform.
We don't mind going through talks, as there's no solution without discussion, but not with those generals. It's not possible. It's not fruitful. It's political suicide.
It's a revolution, they say. They won once when long-serving President Omar al-Bashir was toppled. Now they want his lieutenants gone from politics. And they vow not to stop until civilians take full charge of the country. Anne Soy, BBC News.
And finally, Professor Sir Jonathan Van Tam is leaving his role as England's Deputy Chief Medical Officer. JVT, as he became known, was thanked by Boris Johnson for his extraordinary contribution to our country. Throughout the pandemic, he became famous for his way with words, and particularly his analogies.
Follow the guidance. Don't tear the pants out of it. I think the mum test is very important here. This is a complex product with a very fragile cold chain. It's not a yoghurt. Strikers who score the wonder goals are the ones who make the headlines. Actually, the hard yards are done by the defenders and by the defensive midfielders, tracking back. It's a bit like being 3-0 up in a game and thinking, well, we can't possibly lose this now. But how many times have you seen the other side take it 4-3? Do not wreck this now. We might go down to 10 players. And if that happens, or if that's a risk that it's going to happen, then we need everyone on the pitch to up their game in the meantime. I have not been asked to do Strictly. I've been a bit of a discovator in my past, but probably at the same embarrassing level as most blokes of my age.
JVT, for whom the final whistle has blown. That's it from us too. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a very good night. Bye-bye.